for the uninitiated, I'm sure everyone kind of has gathered what tariffs are, but tariffs essentially for TLDR is they are just, taxes that are implemented on imports, essentially. So, but can you give us more of an insight on like why a government would actually implement tariffs and why, businesses should care?
Sure. So I'd say, first of all, tariffs are a really normal economic tool that governments deploy across the world. And this is definitely not the first time that Canada has been in a trade war-like scenario with major trading partners. But what makes things different this time is the scope at which these tariffs are being put into place. Because generally speaking, a tariff of 5 to 10% can be actually a really effective tool for a government to basically try to limit the incoming goods from the outside so that it can prioritize or focus on its domestic industry. So often a government will impose a tariff in order to slow imports and give a chance to domestic producers to take a bigger market share. And that can be for political reasons or it can be for economic reasons as well. Right. So tariffs are really a normal thing. It's just the tariffs to this scope are a little bit difficult. They're more disruptive than they are because generally a 5 to 10% tariff will get worked out down the supply chain.
Right.
The producer of the good will take a little bit of a hit, the buyer will take a little bit of a hit, and like it'll even out. But when tariffs are as big as the numbers that we're hearing being thrown around now, they can actually be very, very disruptive.
Yeah, it's like 35 to 100% or something like that.
Exactly, 135% for China in a certain.
How do they stack, like, or is it just like a blanket tariff over everything, or?
They can. It depends on the type of tariff.
Okay.
For example, right now China is facing, I believe, a 55% tariff all ink, and it's 3 different tariffs that are added on to one another. There's a general 10% tariff on China. There's a 25% tariff because of the Fentanyl Act on the Emergency Tariff Act on everything. Right. And then there's another 20% tariff that's from the Trump era China tariffs from his first term.
Yeah. Okay.
So those things do stack. However, the U.S. administration has said that all of their new tariff announcements recently are not supposed to stack. But it's not entirely clear sometimes. Unfortunately, it hasn't always been clear what they plan on actually implementing versus what they say that they're doing.
So what's the current situation like with the US and Canada now? I feel like it's just constantly changing. Can't keep up.
It absolutely is. And it's I think the hardest thing to wrap your mind around is, do I really need to believe everything that I hear in the media? And the answer is a little bit of yes and a little bit of no. What I'll say is that, and this is sort of precautionary, is when you hear about a tariff, there's always an implementation date, unless they say it's effective immediately. And more this year, that date has been kind of wielded as a negotiation mechanism. So it's important to read between the lines, read the media, be informed about the tariff announcement is. So the current state of tariffs between the U.S. and Canada is that the U.S. announced their intent to tariff Canada in January after the inauguration for a second term of President Trump. And they quoted an emergency act due to all of the fentanyl flowing into the U.S. to tariff all goods coming from Mexico and Canada by 25% or 10% for potash and energy. But one important thing that they didn't specify when they made the original agreement is that those goods produced in Canada and Mexico who are compliant to the USMCA, which is the current free trade agreement which exists between the 3 countries, are exempt from that tariff because the USMCA supersedes that sort of provision. So it sounded like they wanted to tariff absolutely everyone, and there was a big panic because of that. But the reality is that it's a smaller portion of the total which is eligible for tariffs. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. That 25% now has, the U.S. administration has announced that they will increase that 25% to 35% as of August 1st. So that's the general tariff announcements. And it's important to understand that the majority of goods that are shipped from Canada to the U.S. are USMCA compliant. In fact, there was analysis that was done recently or earlier this year that said that about 94 to 95% of Canada's goods can be USMCA compliant, but they aren't necessarily, and that's a paperwork issue.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think we can talk about that later on. We talk about the challenges and what people need to, and businesses need to keep aware of, but there is a compliance issue there that's been developing.
Okay, that's interesting, yeah.
So that's in terms of the broad tariffs, but then the U.S. followed these tariffs up with targeted tariffs, and these are the ones that are hurting Canada's economy more. So these are tariffs on steel and aluminum, which initially in March were at 25%, but now have been increased to 50%. And then there's tariffs on cars as well of 25%, which were also put into effect in March. That 25% tariff is it excludes, they take away from that 25% the US made content of those Canadian made cars. So the actual tariff rate that a car manufacturer would be paying is probably around 12.5. It's about half of that.
Okay.
And then there's one more tariff, which is recently announced as the tariff on copper, which would be put into place again also on August 1st, which would be a 50% tariff.
50%.
So important to understand, the tariffs on steel and aluminum and copper apply to all countries of the world, but the tariffs on autos apply just to Canada. So that's kind of where we sit right now on the tariff scope from US tariffing Canadian products, but we also have tariffs of American goods that are coming into Canada. So initially, when tariffs were put into place by the US administration, the Canadian administration said that they would respond in kind. And they kind of matched line for line the US announcements. They initially announced 25% tariffs on about $40 billion of US goods coming in. They followed up with 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum products and a 25% tariffs on cars as well. However, the impact of these counter tariffs, what we're calling them, is actually larger for the Canadian population than the US tariffs. And that's because when we bring in goods and we're tariffed, we pay that money, it increases costs and it's inflationary. The final consumer, the Canadian consumer, is the one who's going to have to pay that extra. Right. So in light of the impact that this would have on our economy, the new government in April announced a special provision that would allow manufacturers to import products from the US tariff-free for a certain amount of time, a 6-month period. And we're currently in that. So the new Canadian government has basically taken a step back and said, we understand that this is going to have an impact on our population, so we need to take a little step to mitigate this. So the tariff situation right now with the US, it's largely a one-way thing. It's mostly the US tariffing Canadian goods and not much tariffs going back the other way. And I don't want to downplay the effect of the tariffs coming back because I know that there are some businesses who feel it very acutely. Yeah. But in the large scale of things, it's mostly on the other side that the tariffs are currently in place.